I wasn't a gifted entrepreneur at all. I was riding on the coattails of a really, really good team. And when an office manager would leave, so would the systems in that particular practice because they were all confined in this particular office manager's head. And then it happened in another dental office. When I lose, a front office lead or a clinical lead, things would get super disrupted very, very quickly. If you don't have a good starting franchise prototype, you're going to be multiplying and they're going to get a little bit weaker with each subsequent location.
So assuming your office is very profitable, maybe they don't even market and they're pulling in like 100 new patients a month, but they don't really understand why it's working. If they want to duplicate that success, what should they do before opening the next office?
From the majority of your time going from clinical stuff to admin and CEO leadership stuff, you're going to see a decrease in your personal take-home income. That's a big, big slap in the face for a lot of people that don't anticipate that.
Welcome back to another episode of Dental Marketing Theory. I'm your host, Gary Bird. I'm the owner of SMC National, where we help offices just like yours level the playing field against the big guy out there so you can grow the way that you want. But you can't grow if you try to scale chaos. And this is where we see a ton of dentists make the mistake of growing too soon and trying to open up a second or third location. Today, I have the one, the only, Dr. Mark Costas, who has scaled many, many practices and has helped countless doctors across the country scale their groups. And he's going to share when is the right time to scale and how can you know if your systems are ready for the next step. This was a super informative episode and you're going to love it. Stay tuned. All right. So Mark doesn't really need any introduction. If you've never heard of him before, you're probably not in the dental industry and you're probably on the wrong podcast right now. Mark does an amazing job of sharing his journey and he's very transparent, shares the good, the bad, the ugly, and he's built a ton of awesome stuff in the dental industry that's helped a lot of other people. And today, what I want to dive into, Mark, with you is I want to talk about dentists who've had a successful single practices where they've just absolutely crushed it. And then they say, man, this is pretty easy. I got to where I want to be. And now I want to go to 100 practices. And they start building a second one and a third one. And they raise some money and they open up all the locations. And it gets kind of complex. It gets really hard. I've seen a lot of people actually fail. And then they end up having to close down practices. So I'd love your thoughts and just the experience that you've had and what you've seen out there. What happens when dentists do this? We got a goal to get to 10,000 subscribers and 85% of you are not subscribed to the channel yet. So make it happen. Subscribe. Tell them.
Subscribe.
Good job. Make it happen.
Such an awesome question, Gary. Thank you so much for having me on your show. First and foremost, I will say that I've seen people do it wrong and I've seen people do it right. And I've done it wrong a lot and I've done it right. So I'm going to speak from personal experience first. I think that it's actually a really good example of where you can be misled into thinking that it's time to expand or expansion is a good idea in the first place. Let's just start with my first three practices. I had a very unique opportunity in a very good demographic, and I basically lucked into the demographic where there was a ton of needy patients in a blue-collar area and not a sufficient amount of providers at this particular time. This is in the early 2000s in Central Arizona. So built a practice that went splendidly well. So I thought, hey, this, like you said, this isn't as hard as I thought it was going to be. So I'm going to open another one over here, which was about 45 minutes away, and then another one here, which was an hour and a half away. They all did very, very well. Now, I will preface that by saying that I lucked into some really good office managers and also into some good associates, okay? This was back when it wasn't that difficult to find good people, or dentistry hadn't gone through the evolution that it has from a human resources perspective since COVID. Okay. So they were plentiful. It was reasonable to hire a really good office manager, had 3 good office managers, 2 associates, and I would work in one and we'd rotate around these 3 practices. They did great. By our standards, I would call them black belt level practices, 20% profitability, at least overhead, 50% excluding doctor compensation, very culturally sound, although they weren't consistent amongst the practices. Each individual practice had a decent culture, relatively systemized, I would say, or at least I thought they were. And then, I was like, okay, now I'm going to make a real move. And then I went to 4 and then 5 and then 6 practices. This is all within a 7-year period of time. So I was basically picking up a practice every single year until I hit 6 practices in 7 years. The first year I was an associate. So what happened was that I started to realize that when I'd lose a key player, an office manager, for instance, or an associate in another practice, the wheels kind of fell off the entire thing. What I came to realize was that I wasn't a gifted entrepreneur at all. I was riding on the coattails of a really, really good team. And when an office manager would leave, so would the systems in that particular practice, because they were all confined in this particular office manager's head, right? Yeah. And then it happened in another dental office. When I lose, a front office lead or a clinical lead, things would get super disrupted very, very quickly. Associates as well. I realized that I didn't have a scalable model at all, although it seemed that I did based on the numbers. What I had was a very, very staff-dependent organization. So I think that it's really important that if you were to pressure test this thing to see if you're ready to go from 3 to 10, you're going to have to look to see if you are staff-dependent or if you're a systems-dependent dental practice. And I think that's very, very important.
I see this even on a smaller scale, where people will start marketing and sometimes the front desk person leaves. Sometimes they're really amazing at their job and they get promoted, or they just quit out of the blue, right? I know a lot of offices that deal with that. And it turns out that you hire someone new and you put them at the front desk and your conversion tanks and the rest of your practice falls apart because this one person changed and you didn't train them properly. So you're 100% right. Your whole practice can absolutely just fall apart based on one person. And that's a really dangerous place to be. So how do you pressure test for that? If you could go back to when you had 3 practices, what would you make sure that your team could really handle for scaling to 4, 5, or 6?
Yeah, I think the big thing is that you have to remove each key person from their role, at least for a period of time, to see if the operation would run without them. If I was going to put somebody in with my current training, my current onboarding protocol into their position, how long would it take for them to be able to take over that role seamlessly and operate at a similar level? It might be 85% of the previous all-star level 10 person, but at least is it enough to keep this machine running in the right direction? And if you could do that for each individual position, then you know that you're sufficiently systemized.
All right. Would you recommend that the key player goes on vacation, or do you just send them off somewhere else? Or how, what's a good way to really test the systems and do cross training?
I think you can virtually do this, right? I think you could literally say okay, without them here, or if we'll put them on a special project, or we will cross train. Let's teach them how to do scans in a pinch, or let's put them on this particular AR project for even 3 days. Like, how does the practice run without them? Nobody's allowed to talk to them at all. My friend Alistair calls this red teaming. So you imagine the worst case scenario where you're removing people either physically or virtually from their main role, and then see how the practice runs without them. Then you could see if you're sufficiently systemized for each individual role in the dental practice. You don't have to do it all at once. Some people do, but you can take key roles and remove them from those roles to see how the practice runs without that particular personality and that particular individual.
Assuming you've done all of that and you redlined your office, you've cross-trained, you closed team gaps, what's the next step after that? When do you know your team is ready to move forward?
Yeah, I'm going to assume that this practice now, because you're to the stage where you're red teaming, you're looking at the overall systemization, the pressure test of this operation, that this is already what I would call a black belt level practice. Very, very highly productive. Overhead within check. All the categories in the P&L look really good. Michael Gerber would call this the franchise prototype. So you don't want to replicate something until it's perfect.
Yeah, I've heard that too. So it's like, don't scale chaos, right? If something's chaotic, you don't want more of it because it's just going to make it worse. if things are chaotic at one office, trying to scale is going to collapse the whole thing.
Exactly. And what happens is, and this happened to me too. Again, like personally, I made this mistake. A few blue belt or white belt level practices, you get tired of trying to fix these things. So everything else starts to look really attractive. I'm going to focus not necessarily on fixing these, but I'm going to buy 2 more. And then those ones I'm really, really going to work hard on. So now you have 5 average practices or below average practices. And this is what we see in regional groups that end up failing or large DSOs that end up failing is they're actually purchasing failing or below standard assets. And then they have a portfolio of underperforming practices. And it's like, well, it's because your parameters weren't strong enough and you didn't know how to vet out these really good black belt level practices in our vernacular. So, I think that, have you ever seen that movie Multiplicity with Michael Keaton, where he was way too busy, so he figured out a way to clone himself. But every clone that he created was a little stupider than the one previous. So like he would take himself and then clone it, and then he would clone that clone, and that clone was a little bit stupider than the first clone, and the next clone was a little bit stupider than that one. And before you know it, they were just kind of like really, really ridiculously stupid clones. That's what happens with dental practices. If you don't have a good starting franchise prototype, you're going to be multiplying, and they're going to get a little bit weaker with each subsequent location.
So assuming your office is very profitable, maybe they don't even market and they're pulling in like 100 new patients a month, but they don't really understand why it's working. If they want to duplicate that success, what should they do before opening the next office?
No, this is a really, really good point. And you're very observant to notice this. What happens is they can't figure out what the secret sauce is. And typically the secret sauce in large part is the owner CEO, right? Yeah. So the owner CEO then is like, all right, I'm going to replicate everything, same decor, same core values, same systems, same everything. I'm going to put an associate in this office, and I'm going to work mainly at the flagship office, at the primary office, and then I'm going to go check on them once a week. And then they find that, okay, this thing is getting a little bit of traction, but it's nowhere near the traction that the first practice has. And that's that secret sauce that the actual owner, who cares more about this operation than anybody ever will, because it's their baby and it's their risk and it's their liability and it's their investment. So number 2 is always just a little bit less successful than number 1, or oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes. And then you go to 3, and then the owner doctor is diluted even further. The true tipping point is when this doctor can't visit all of their practices in 1 week. So you're looking at two days here, 2 days here, and 1 day here. Everything starts to suffer, and you begin to cannibalize that primary location that was the golden child and the one that was producing the majority of the profit. And then that starts to slowly erode, and then you're starting to spend a little bit more attention on number 2, a little bit on number 3. The tipping point is when you get to number 4 and they can't even visit that practice at all in a week's period of time, even further diluted. This is when you have to have a really, really strong executive level team, a regional manager, somebody that really just kind of embodies what your core values are and understand your vision for this group and the evolution, et cetera. What happens often as well is that the primary CEO, the doctor, or this group of doctors doesn't realize that when they transition from the primary clinical producer in each of these practices to becoming the main administrator or the COO or the CEO of a practice, you're switching over from profitability in each of these offices to pay your family or to feed your family versus what's very predictable, being a badass clinical producer. And almost always when you switch over from the majority of your time going from clinical stuff to admin and CEO leadership stuff, you're going to see a decrease in your personal take-home income. It's a big, big slap in the face for a lot of people that don't anticipate that.
Yeah, I read a thing about Chick-fil-A where the owner of Chick-fil-A, when he first got started, he went to another business and they said, "My pleasure." And he really liked that. And so he ended up wanting to push that into all of his locations. And it took him years and years and years to do it. In fact, he actually had to start threatening the franchisors that they were going to lose their franchise if they didn't train their team. And it wasn't easy to do. So imagine now trying to do that inside of dental, like trying to push down culture from the top down. It's really hard to do.
Yeah, that is such a cool story. I'm going to have to borrow that. I really love that. And that is the speed of implementation that with the larger you get. It's interesting. I'm going to not mention any names, but I've worked with several billion-dollar level clearinghouses / merchandisers / distributors of dental merchandise and equipment, et cetera. And anything that you have to do, if you're speaking at one of their events, if you are adding yourself to the catalog, if you are going to become a KOL for a certain branch of their organization, the bureaucracy is so big because, 25, 35, 40,000 employees, billions of dollars in revenue, 150 vice presidents, like everybody has to put their stamp and look at it. Everything takes such a long period of time. It's unbelievable. And implementation is one thing. But to get it to stick, when you have, 1,000 people in the field, they won't even hear about certain things for years. So you're totally right. I will say additionally, we kind of glossed over it a little bit, but I think there's also like this mystical subconscious thing that happens when the actual owner is there in a lot of cases. Everybody's behavior is a little bit different and better. Yeah. Everybody's performance is a little bit different and better. Production is always a little bit higher because you're hustling to get that same day patient in there instead of rescheduling them. People just perform differently when the owner is there, and you can almost always see it that like if an owner has 4 practices and they're in one practice every single week, and then they're without that doctor for the rest of the week, the doctor's day is always the highest production and always the smoothest, almost always.
So you've got labor-intensive, location-specific businesses, and before scaling locations, you need to scale yourself as a CEO and a leader.
I like to see slow and controlled growth, but when I say slow, that could be, 1 practice a year. It could be 2 practices a year. That still could be slow. There's certain DSOs out there that have a mandate to grow by 3 to 4 practices per month. And that's difficult to do, but you're talking about an infrastructure where they have people, in half of the country that are recruiting associate doctors and office managers and looking for those practices to purchase 24/7. You as an individual for doc or for office startup or regional group, you have to understand that that's who you're competing with, right? So I do believe that if you are constantly looking and you have your finger on the pulse, you'll be able to, and depending on your model, it's much easier to scale at an acquisition model versus a de novo model. So there's a lot of things that kind of come into play. I will say, Gary, that this because you've seen people grow from small regional groups to larger regional groups to, DSOs, a formidable mid-tier DSO. And what happens is you run out of traditional money relatively quickly, right? Yeah. The big 3 banks are only going to lend you till about maybe 3 practices, depending on their performance, sometimes 4. But then unless you have a very good relationship with a regional or local bank, you're looking at $4 million, maybe $5 million in total debt, even if you have a very good performing operation. So you're going to be looking at either hard money, family money, bringing partners in, private equity, sometimes some exotic things where you're looking. In my case, when I got to 5, 6 practices, I had to get really creative where I was looking for deals that were, owner financing was available, or there was a distressed practice and I would go in and I would save the day by taking over the lease and just taking the equipment. Those aren't always easy to do, but you have to do what you have to do if you want to continue to scale. You have to get pretty creative. I'm not a huge fan anymore of buying a distressed asset and trying to turn it around. I think it's much easier to start from scratch with 0 patients than to take something that's sinking and to try to right-side it. But that my opinions have changed significantly over the years.
Okay, so how does someone know to start focusing and improving what they already have rather than adding more locations? I know that's really hard as an entrepreneur because we don't ever want to fix things and make them better. We just want to do more and do the next exciting thing. So how does somebody actually know when to turn that dial?
Yeah. Once again, I've made this mistake. So these are great questions, Gary. I had in my head for the longest time just a number, right? I had 10 in my head. It just over and over again is like, I got to get to 10. I was at 3. Okay. My next step is 5. Let's pick up 2 more. Let's do 7. And then I finally got to 10. 10 was the most I ever owned at one period of time. I had 16 total. And now we have a new DSO that we're forming that is starting with 10. So really I've had 26 now at this point, but it is so true that at a certain point you look up and you're like, I'm doing this just for an ego number. And what real Wall Street, what if you're going to be looking at consolidation and a private equity backed DSO, these people are very, very prudent about the type of asset that they're picking up. Not so much in the past, which is why now several DSOs have failed, large DSOs have failed because of this exact philosophy. I got to get to a certain number, as many stores as possible. And then you look up and you're like, this thing is run like crap, and they're purchasing really, really bad assets, or they'll buy a regional group that's failing of a dozen practices. Now they have another dozen practices on the book that are negative cash flow. We see this happen all the time. Secondarily, there was a period with this DSO cycle of growth and trajectory when people were more concerned about adding EBITDA to the overall organization by purchasing it, and took their focus off same store growth. So what would happen is you'd have a bolus of 50 practices and you're like, we need, and it would be say $25 million in EBITDA, right? Just round numbers. And they're like, we need to get to $50 million in EBITDA before our next recap cycle in 36 months. So we're going to go find $25 million in EBITDA to purchase, right? Because they have deep pockets. They're a private equity company that's billions of dollars of investable capital. So they're going and they're buying as fast as they possibly can, took their eye off the ball, or in many cases weren't focusing enough on same store growth, and they were unable to recap because they had so many underperforming assets in their portfolio. So that has actually changed significantly, Gary. I've been in a lot of private equity boardrooms over the last 2.5 years because we went through our own kind of recap situation and funding situation to actually get the financial backing to purchase, several hundred practices. So I've sat and I've watched kind of the cycles of private equity and of DSOs that have failed and those that haven't. The ones that are actually able to recap and that are a good acquisition target for large private equity companies now, and DSOs that are looking for regional groups, are the ones that have significant and consistent same store growth. So you're looking at, they're saying between 3 and 7% growth year over year, which for a lot of people sounds easy to do, especially the gunners out there that are experiencing 15 to 25% growth year over year. But what happens is a lot of times, they get 60 or 70% of this high multiple. They take their foot off the gas. They put an associate in there. Maybe they have some turnover because the office manager doesn't like the new corporate culture or whatever, and they start to flatten and then decline. You got to kind of watch that if you are a regional practice owner, to make sure that all of the practices are moving in the right direction. Same store growth is just as important as adding a new practice and adding EBITDA via acquisition.
I've noticed that investors in private equity and dental are getting a lot smarter about dental, and they understand dental a lot more than they did just a couple of years ago. So they're getting better at asking questions. How should a practice owner think about maximizing what they currently have to make it better in the eyes of investors?
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to kind of navigate through that question in a couple different ways. Let me know if I'm hitting your main point here. So, okay, first and foremost, there is a tipping point where multiples go up significantly. So if you're looking, and I'm just going to throw round numbers out there, based on my personal experience lately, things have changed quite a bit. The days of being able to get a 10 or 12 for a single practice, no matter how good or how big it is, are kind of gone now. Like, you need to have over an accumulated $10 million in EBITDA to get anywhere in the 7, 8, or 9 multiple range, right? So that means as a single practice, if you are above $500,000 to $1 million in EBITDA, you'd be lucky right now to get to a 6 to 7, maybe 7.5 times your EBITDA as a single practice or a small group. Okay, that's just what I've seen as of late. We all know that there's been in the history of all of this, we've heard people get 12s for a single practice, 15x for a group. We haven't seen that happen for years, and I don't think it'll ever come back to that. But 7, 8, 9 is still really good for any industry to be able to get that. Okay, so it does come down to an accumulated number of EBITDA. For most private equity companies, the low end is like a $400,000 in EBITDA. So if it's a 20% profitable practice, which we would consider a pretty dang good practice, you're looking at $2 million top line, 20%, $400,000 in EBITDA. That's kind of the low threshold to get, maybe a 5 or 6.
That's a low. So that you would be saying you're on the low threshold of optimized at that point.
Correct. Low threshold of an acquisition target by a good DSO at this point. Okay. Now, optimized could mean anything. Like you could have $1 million practice and be 30% profitable. You're only $300,000 in EBITDA, but that is a damn good practice. And I would invest in that practice as long as they had room to grow. So another thing to consider, Gary, and this is the other kind of fork in the road that I was going to talk about, is you and I talk to a lot of young dentists that are either thinking about acquiring or starting up a dental practice, and they really don't know what the physical capacity of a practice should be at minimum in order to make a good financial choice for a purchase, right? So we see people, and I might have something to do with this. I've been on the air for 10 years, and I used to have a totally different philosophy. Like little and mighty used to be like my battle cry. Like a lifestyle practice was like 3 to 4 operatories with 1 office manager, 1 chairside assistant, 1 hygienist, and you guys are 35% overhead. What a great life. What I've changed over the years, it's like that no longer to me sounds like a freedom practice, because if you go, office manager goes, clinical assistant goes, you're so vulnerable in so many different ways because you're so small that you don't have any redundancies and you don't have an additional provider. So you're chained to the practice no matter what.
Yeah, and almost at that size, you can't even really add another provider, because if you put them in there, you have to leave and now you have no money. Like you're... Right? Exactly.
So we have found, and private equity is kind of the same way, a very, very minimum is 6 operatories and ideally 7 plus. So
room to open up more is what I've seen a lot of people doing, where it's like, we're putting in 6 now, but we can add 2, 3, 4 more if we want to.
Exactly. Because if you're a good operator, and you don't need to necessarily scale to multiple locations. I've seen people go from 6 to 20 in the same location, and they're such good operators and they have such a good reputation and they have such a good patient experience. Patients keep on coming. And let me tell you, Gary, I would rather have a 20 operatory practice at 25% profitability than 10 practices.
Yeah. Well, there's less risk there. I mean, I would say that's easier. That sounds easier to me. I'm not a dentist, so I've never done it, but that sounds easier to me to grow one big office than to try to have a medium-sized office and then try to duplicate that success again. Would you agree?
Absolutely. So with every location, you're multiplying the complexity of your organization, multiplying the actual overhead that you have to control. Having something under 4 walls is much easier, I think. Now, I'm not anti-multiple practices. I'm just saying that.
At what point would you say a practice is optimized and ready to scale? Are you looking at an EBITDA number, a revenue target, or something else?
Private equity cares about one number, and that's EBITDA.
If you could go back and change how you scaled and how you grew your practices, what would you change?
Yeah, I had probably 4 practices that were less than 7 operatories. I would just eliminate all of those completely. And this second part might surprise you a little bit, but some of my most successful practices from a cash flow, overhead, and profitability standpoint were in very rural areres because there was no competition. Like very, very inexpensive to operate there. You know, you could buy a building and it, like very, very manageable expenses. People in that area don't necessarily require a huge hourly wage in comparison to the rest of the jobs in that area. So a lot of people kind of followed my lead and they started putting these practices in these rural areas, and they're like, man, this is great, until you realize the true cost. The true cost is It's very difficult to hire people in rural areas. So if you're not actually the provider, man, it's tough. And I'm talking, I would have to give people 10 years ago, I'd have to give people $25,000 bonuses to go and work in that area.
Just to sign on, right?
Just
like,
to sign
okay, fine,
on.
I'll move there for 3 years.
Yep.
And they're planning on leaving. They're like, I'm going to come there, but I'm leaving in 3 years. So you're going to have to find somebody else, right?
That's right. That's right. And difficult to get hygienists, difficult to get office managers. And then in addition to all of that uphill battle, like you're experiencing good cash flow, and the patients are very, very forgiving as far as the clinical quality because they don't really have another option. But when it comes time to roll up or to sell, it's very, for the same reasons, it's very difficult to unload those assets. So I would probably stick to more metropolitan areas, pay a little bit more money to acquire practices in more attractive areas for associates, even though it would take a little bit longer to scale those. Profitability might be a little slim for the first few years in comparison to the rural areas, but I would have stayed away from those. So capacity, the size, the physical size of the buildings that I was either purchasing or leasing to put the practices in, I would most definitely pay attention to those. And the demographic that I selected, I would change for sure if I could do it all over again.
Thank you so much, Mark. This is a great episode. I really appreciate you sharing all of this and just diving deep into the weeds. If someone wants to connect and learn more about what you guys are doing, what's the best way to reach out to you?
Yeah. Once again, Gary, thank you so much. I know you could have anybody on your podcast. It's a pleasure and privilege to be on. So thank you very much. Best way to find me probably is socials. I'm Dr. Mark Costas on Instagram. I'm on TikTok as well. But Instagram, if you DM me, that comes across very, very quickly. Also, anything that you guys want to hear about as far as our programs, truedentalsuccess.com. It's got an events tab and kind of the coaching levels that myself and my 22 coaches around the country kind of handle. And then just, if you want free content, I have 2,300 episodes that go back 10 years. My 10-year anniversary for the podcast, Gary, is June of 2025. 2,300 episodes. We do one every single day. Haven't missed a day in 10 years. So the podcast is always available for free.
Thanks so much for coming on. I always learn a ton from listening to you, and you always have a great way of changing my perspective on things that seem straightforward, but there's always another layer to it. So I appreciate you coming on and sharing your insight and just all that you do for the dental industry.
Thank you, Gary. You're really good at this, man. Keep it up.
Hey, thanks so much for listening to the whole podcast. You're truly one of our greatest fans, and we really appreciate you. And we want to give you a $3,000 marketing credit to be used to grow your office. We have the link right down below. We'll meet really quickly. It takes about 15 minutes, and we'll tell you how you can save $3,000 on growing your office. And if you're an existing client, let us know, because this is for new clients, but we have some giveaways for existing clients as well. And it's great. So you'll love it. Thank you so much for listening. We really, really appreciate you.